Just trying to decide between the haircut tent and the manicure pedicure tent myself. So looking forward to that. It'll be nice. It's true when you don't have hair to mess with yourself. Like my son Sam, just has awesome God-given hair. It'll probably fall out one day, but don't tell him that yet. So I'm just like, can I comb your hair? Can I just do that? I don't ever get to. And so I'm going to hook that up, Tenderloin, if they will let me. You guys doing all right this morning? Awesome. Well, hey, one of the big ideas for us here at Epic is we love the idea of story. And part of even the reason why our church is called Epic Church is that a couple meanings for Epic for us. One is that we want to pursue things beyond the ordinary or mediocre. But the other is this idea of Epic as story. We believe that God is writing this grand narrative throughout history and throughout eternity. We think it's a story of renewal and redemption and restoration. And it's this really big story. But the thing that humbles us and really amazes us is that in this grand narrative God's up to throughout eternity, He's invited us in as active participants. Now, you don't get to be the main character, okay? Just if you need to be, you need to go find something else where you can be. It'll be a small story, like a B movie. But you can go be the main character somewhere else. But in this story, God's the main character, but He allows us in. He invites us in as active participants. And as we continue the No More Religion series this morning, what we're going to find is Paul sharing with us his story of really this profound story. But what's great is that Paul doesn't just have a great story because he's great and he had a lot to offer the world. He has a great story because Christ interrupted his life, just like He can interrupt our lives, hand us a great story, and give us a platform to share our story. And so I want to really think through this idea of story for what we're going to do today. If you weren't here last week, catch the podcast. Again, cure for insomnia if you're struggling with that. But catch the podcast. 4 of you got it. That's great. Catch the podcast. What we're doing in this series, it'll be the lengthiest series we've ever done. We're actually walking through the book of Galatians, and here's why. We think this is going to be so freeing for our church to understand no more religion isn't religion in the positive sense. It's that negative sense of religion equals us having to do something to appease God or to gain His acceptance or to get His approval, and that we believe that God, through Jesus, offers us something much better. And this is the issue Paul's writing to the Galatians about. So we're going to pick up in chapter 1 of Galatians, verse 10. If you need a Bible, raise your hand. Our volunteers are equipped to give you your very own copy, all right? Just keep your hands up high. We'll get you one, and we will let you know what page we're on. As you get one of these Bibles, we're on page 631. I know many of you have your Bible on your smartphone, your iPad. Some of you still actually carry paper. We'll have it on the screen, and so there should be no reason that you couldn't get this story this morning. Page 631, though, on the Bibles that we are passing out. So glad that you guys are here today. We're going to pick up in verse 10. You can go ahead and stand with me. Galatians 1:10. We'll actually read through the end of the chapter. And before some of you are like, oh, Ben, I'm ADD. I can't stay focused that long. It's a really good story, and I think it moves quickly enough for us to stay engaged long enough. So in verse 10 of Galatians 1, really thinking again of this idea of our story and sharing our story, Paul writes, "For am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man," indicating he had before, "I would not be a servant of Christ. For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel preached by me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. But when He who had set me apart before I was born, and who called me by His grace, was pleased to reveal His Son to me, in order that I might preach Him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. But I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. In what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still unknown in person to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. But listen to his story here. They only were hearing it said, he who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. And they glorified God because of me. Pretty cool story, huh? Maybe this God's up to something in history. And maybe he's up to something in Paul's life, no doubt. And maybe, just maybe, he's up to something in ours as well. You may be seated. We could really start with verse 10, and I could give you an hour-long message. I know you guys love those. I could give you an hour-long message just on verse 10. Verse 10 is impactful enough. It is something that the majority, I'm going to say 100% of us at some point in time deal with. And so I could just lay into you with a message on verse 10, and we could be fully satisfied that we got enough, because all of us wrestle with this. I just want to begin by asking the question to you that Paul really asked about himself. Here's the question for us, verse 10. Do you live for the approval of people or for the approval of God? Do you live for the approval of people or for the approval of God? Paul says, am I now seeking the approval of man? He does let us know at the end, if I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. Do you live for the approval of others or the approval of God? Now, don't answer this too quickly, and here's why. I'm going to guess that in some way, shape, or form, every one of us, including the guy on the stage, do this, live for the approval of people at least once a week, if not once an hour. Okay? In fact, I had this message prepared. It's amazing where all the approval of man shows up in our lives. I want you to think about where it shows up in yours. Even as I had this message written, I did all my rehearsal and memorization last night. I'm like, oh, this is good. I've got these great examples. I load my phone up with music that we sing at Epic this morning. I've got about a 20-minute walk to the Glen Park BART station. I live in Noe Valley, but if I take that long walk to that station, I get to keep eating cinnamon rolls, and that is true. And I don't care if you approve of that. It's just fact. Seriously, people are like, how do you do it? Well, I just keep walking, all right? So I'll give you the donut cinnamon roll ratio to miles you need to walk later. But so I'm doing that. I've got my earbuds in, and I'm just listening to this worship music, some of the songs that Brad has done already and that he will do before our service is over today. And I find myself, I start singing out loud. And then I'm like, oh no, right? Why? Well, mine might not just be an approval issue. It might be that I want the neighbors not to call the police. But it's amazing how the approval of man, the approval of others, shows up in your life. Some of you do the business practices the way that you do them because of your need for approval. Some of you have terrible relational habits because of your need for the approval. I'm not talking to people who are married this morning, but some of you are dating and you're staying in the relationship because you need him to approve of you. You're staying in the relationship because he's well known in his industry, and who cares if he's a terrible boyfriend, a terrible fiance? People get to see you with him, and they think, oh, you ride with that, you stay with that, you live with that. And all of a sudden, the need for approval shows up there. Some of you are in a terrible financial mess because of your need for approval. This really is how debt comes around, right? We see something we have to have, we can't afford it, but we need the approval of people we don't even know, right? Isn't that how debt shows up? Like, I've got to have that. Doesn't matter if I can afford it. I need them to think, like, I never get to see the outside of the car, but the people that get to see the outside of the car, they need to approve of me. I need to live this way. I need to have this. And so the need for approval shows up all throughout our lives. And it's some ways really obvious. In some ways, it's not. Like, some of you love this newfound faith that you have in Jesus. But you still deal with the approval issue. So here's what's happening in your life. You have this thing you love to do on Sundays, and you love to share with your small group, and you're pumped about the Serve the City event, and you should be. But some of you in this room, you have been unwilling to share your faith with any of your coworkers, with any of your neighbors, and some of the people who live under the same roof you do have no idea what you're doing this morning. They think you're out for a run. Why? Because we care often more about the approval we can get from other people than we even care about them coming into the story that God's invited us into. This is a dangerous thing. It's a very dangerous thing. In fact, some of you, we have baptism opportunities next week for those of you that know that's the next step in your faith. And let me just tell you this. We have a pretty long list of people that are in that process. And before you freak out, no, God's not whispered it to us, and we know who you are, okay? You've indicated on a card or online or with your small group leader in a conversation with our staff, you've indicated that's your next step. And for some of you, you haven't done it yet for some really, really obvious and good reasons. Waiting for your parents to be able to be in town, waiting for your kids to be able to come and see this. You weren't in town the last time we did baptism. But for some of you, I can guarantee the reason you haven't taken that step yet is because of your need to be approved of by others. You begin to think, what if so-and-so is in the crowd that day? What if one of my friends who doesn't know I'm a Christian starts looking for a church and they see a video of me going in some water at a church, right? And what's crazy is that the approval of man, it will just do things to us that are just bad. In fact, one of the worst things I think that it does to us is that when you live for the approval of other people, here's what happens. In your eyes, people begin to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And you're like, what's wrong with that? Well, simultaneously, in your eyes, God is getting smaller, smaller, and smaller. Why? Because you say that you're doing this Jesus thing, but the reality is you don't care if God approves. You got to make sure that he does and she does and that group does and my coworkers do and my neighbors do and my mom and dad do and my spouse does. But when we truly find our approval in Jesus, it will free us from seeking the approval of people. When we truly, not when we check it on a box, not when we get it right one day, but when we get into this pattern of embracing the fact that in Jesus, God has approved of us, we cannot enjoy that approval and simultaneously long for the approval of other people. So when we truly find our approval in Jesus, we will be free from seeking the approval of people. It's a very freeing thing. And Paul goes on to tell us, I'll give you this principle that Paul gives us out of the end of verse 10. Here it is, and this is one that should really make us nervous, okay, because we kind of want it both ways. But here's what we will find. We will find it impossible to live as a God-pleaser and a people-pleaser. We will find it impossible to live as a God-pleaser and a people-pleaser. Look at what Paul says at the end of 10. If I were still trying to please man, so he's lived that life, we all have. Even for those of you who say you don't care what we think, you started the day with a different outfit, but you were worried about our thoughts, right? You're not wearing now what you tried on to begin with, what you set out last night, if some of you still do that. We all care at times, way too much. If I were still trying to please man, Paul says, I would not be a servant of Christ. This is a very tough issue for your pastor. Ever since I can remember, I've wanted approval. I wanted to wear the right shirt. I wanted to be thought of by my friends in high school as being part of the right group. Wanted mom and dad to approve of me. Had a series of coaches I needed to approve of me. And I don't think it was just this outright sinful thing. I think all of our hearts are bent towards approval. And the reality is you're going to look for approval. Okay? It's not that I've quit looking for approval, but I've just got to look in the right place for my approval. You need to look in the right place for your approval. It has exhausted me. Right? And at least once a week, this rears its ugly head. At least once a week, just because of what I'm doing right now. Will they think I'm funny? Come on, approve me. Come on. Fake laugh, real laugh. I don't care. It's on the podcast. They won't be able to tell. For the 4 of them that listen. I want people to think I'm inspiring. I just want, in a genuine way, I want to be approved of for being helpful. I want you guys to think that I chose the right staff. I want you guys to think that we're moving the right direction as a church. I want you guys to think that I'm a good dad. But here's what's true. Not everybody's going to agree with the decisions I make as a leader of this church. Now, I'm not going to do this to say I'm the leader, who cares? All right, I'm not going there, but not everyone's going to approve of it. Not everyone's going to agree with the way Shauna and I raise our boys. Not all of you are going to agree with the way that I spend my time. Especially if you want more of it. Well, the reality is probably you want less of it. But not everyone's going to approve of what I do. And they're not going to approve of what you do completely. But it's this exhausting thing if we continue just to try to please people. Right? I want you to begin thinking, like, what are the things in your life where it's obvious you're just trying to please people and you are exhausted by it? Right? You want to know who's observing you and do they approve? You do it for your professors. You do it for your boss. You still do it for your parents. And it doesn't matter how old our parents are, right? Please don't tell me that changes when we get out of the house. And there's a genuineness to that it's not wrong. Like, I want my dad to have this great relationship, and he gives me feedback after every single sermon, which is usually great. But no, Dad, you give me great feedback always. And thanks for keeping the other stuff to yourself. He'll be watching. There's nothing wrong with genuinely wanting to be effective or to want your spouse to think that you're attractive. That's, guys, the positive thing. But when you long for it and when you set your sights on approval of others, it becomes this thing that just wears you out. And so I wonder if we could just enjoy the freedom that God gives us, because here's what happens. In the gospel, what we find out is that in Jesus, and I don't know how all this works, it's magical almost, but it's certainly supernatural. In the gospel, it tells us that in Jesus, God approves of us. And you're like, Ben, you don't know my story. Not your story that God approves of. But when you embrace faith in Jesus, remember this whole idea we're talking about in this series, it's by grace alone, through faith alone, in Jesus alone, right? If you're counting on something else, be careful. But in this reality, when God looks at us through Christ, he approves. And here's what I want you to think about. I want you to get your creative thinking ready, okay? I know it's Sunday, but at least you're not the 9:30 crowd, okay? I want you to get your creative thinking ready. I want you to envision a day, for all of us collectively, but for you, I want you to envision the day where you begin to live from the approval of God rather than for the approval of others. Just get that life in your head. You're living from God's approval rather than for the approval of people. Get that in your mind. In what ways at that moment will your life look different? Lots of answers I think that we could come up with. Let me give you a few thoughts I have. I think one thing that we would see is our level of anxiety going down and our level of peace going up. I think another thing that we'd see is that we wouldn't spend so much time trying to come up with great statuses on Facebook and Twitter so people would think we're awesome. Another thing that I would think would show up is you would quit Googling your name so much. No, you're not the only one. I think we would have more free time and energy left because we wouldn't spend so much time, so much focus, and so much energy trying to conjure up an image that we hope everyone else is pleased with. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you the spiritual in this, and then I just want to give you the common sense thing. The spiritual in this is this: get your approval from God in Jesus. When we celebrate communion later this morning, the idea is we're celebrating that Jesus is taking something that belonged to me, and somehow as God looks through this atonement, he sees me as pure. Somehow he sees me as holy. He sees me as clean. That God approves of us in Jesus. So that's the spiritual part. The common sense thing is this: haven't you lived long enough to know you can't please everyone? And I think the one word that comes to mind is the word that I think if you go, hey, what's the book of Galatians all about? You could come up with a lot of things, but I think what you're going to see emerge over the next 11 weeks or so is this word freedom. Something that's not just positionally true, because if you're a Christian, you're free positionally, but you might not be embracing your freedom daily. Imagine living in that free way. You would have more time than you have now. You would have greater joy than you have now. You would have less anxiety than you have now. You'd probably be wearing some outlandish outfits once you quit caring about what we thought about it, right? Don't go too outlandish, all right? Keep our eyes pure. Come on. But you would live differently. I would live differently. That's that approval deal. And again, we could spend all of our time. But Paul gets into his story. He says in 11 and 12 that I didn't get the gospel from Jesus, from anyone besides Jesus. And here's what, this is huge. We get secondhand things, right, from Matthew, Mark, Luke, Paul, everybody else. Paul is letting us know, I didn't read this in a scroll somewhere. I wasn't sitting around and one of our really smart religious leaders told me what I needed to think about God. He says that he got it directly from revelation from Jesus. Like Jesus just shows up, he reveals to him, here's the truth. Look at what Paul says about his life. Maybe you won't feel so bad about yours. For you have heard of my former life, verse 13, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism, so he's saying I was advancing in my religion. I was so good. Like he's telling us all state honors in Judaism. I was going beyond people of the same age as me. Check me out. I was so extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers. Here's why this should scare us. Paul thought he was doing something to get himself closer to God. And in fact, he was getting very far away from God. Not only was Paul getting away from God, he was opposing the very thing God was up to in the first century with this Jesus movement. And now, this principle that emerges from Paul's life and really out of this series, this is the reason we're doing the series. You'll see this on the screen, but here's what we didn't know. It is possible to be very religious and be very far from God. Isn't that scary? Like, it is possible to come to church more than anyone else. It is possible to attend your small group. It is possible to recite certain prayers. And some of you have come out of a background where that was the whole thing. It was religion. It was rituals. It was regulations. It was say this prayer 14 times. Make sure you hold this while you pray. Some of you have come from that. And Paul just shows us that not only does religion not get you closer to God, it actually makes you very far from God. Paul learned that his religion could not gain him acceptance from God, and neither can yours. The good things you do. I want you to think about the good things you do. Some of you have to go way back. Why do you do them? Are you doing them so that God might accept and approve of you? Are you doing that in response to this amazing grace that has rescued you from your sin? Outwardly, it'll kind of all look the same, right? You do the church thing, you follow and get baptized, you start sharing your faith, you start leading a small group, you start caring about your neighbor. Outwardly, it can all look the same. But you know your motivation. Experience the freedom that comes with going, you know what, God, I'm not going to do this so you'll love me. I'm so thankful I got that already. I'm going to do this because you love me. Cause-effect changes everything in this situation. Get this equation correct. Do we do good things? Yes. Not to get to God. Because God has rescued us, we do it in response. We're going to go serve the city in 2 weeks. Don't miss out on that, what Lindsay was talking about. It's going to be huge. If you care about your own spiritual growth, even if you don't care about the people in the Tenderloin, this will cause your spiritual growth, promise. But don't do it so that you somehow check your boxes off for 2013. Do it because God has rescued you. He has approved of you in Jesus. That's why you should do it. And one of the things that Paul finds out is that his religion doesn't get him acceptance to God or with God, and his evil deeds don't keep him from being accepted by God. My guess is that most of us in this room, we either live in one of these two camps. One, we think we've done enough to get to God, or two, we've been so evil, so bad, so sinful that we could never be accepted by God. You probably live in one of those two. Here's what Tim Keller says about this idea. He says that no one is so good that they don't need the grace of the gospel, nor so bad that they can't receive the grace of the gospel. Isn't that good? Because most of us are in one, even if you're not extreme in one of those two areas, most of us are in one of those two places. Either you think you've done enough to gain what God is waiting for you to attain, or you think you've done so much, right? And you're like, some of you are like, Ben, you don't know how bad it's been. Or Ben, you don't know how good I am. When we get the question, which we do often, like, Ben, so-and-so doesn't believe in Jesus, but they're a really good person. Well, because I'm not a really good person, I'm really grateful that it's grace and not our goodness or our badness. And then besides, the Bible says we've all kind of entered and started in base camp together where we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So if you're depending on your goodness to get you in, or if you're believing that your badness keeps you out, the gospel says you're both welcome, but it's by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. What are you depending on? Paul tried to get in through religion. He just found out it wouldn't work. And so Paul's talked to us about religion. Then look at 15 and 16. He begins to tell us about discovering something that wasn't religion. He says in 15 that when he who had set me apart before I was born and called me by his grace, verse 16, that God was pleased to reveal his son to me. This is so good for me to hear it said this way. Because even when I believe that this gospel thing is for me, sometimes, have you ever been around people that some do things for you because they love you, and other people do it for you begrudgingly? You ever been around that? Moms and dads, you know how this works. Husbands and wives, you know how this works. People who work anywhere, you know how this works. Right? It's one thing for someone to do something for you begrudgingly, like, I guess. It's another thing when they do it out of the goodness of their heart. Sometimes, if I'm honest, when I think about God, even when I believe this gospel story, I think, God, God's kind of gritting his teeth and going, all right, Ben, I guess. But Paul says, God delights. God is well pleased. This is a tough one for me to get my brain around. It says that he's well pleased to give me his son. He's well pleased to reveal Jesus to you. So he's not doing it begrudgingly this morning. He's not going, okay, I guess I'll include you. He's saying to you, that's my plan. This is how the story goes. This is what I'm writing. This is what I'm up to, and it's nothing of your own merit. Don't we love to have things of our own merit? Give me some recognition. Give me some award. Give me a Twitter follower. Right? I need a Facebook friend. Come on, I've earned it. God gives it to us not based on our merit. Just out of love, grace, and mercy, compassion, kindness, goodness to us. He gives that to us. And then Paul says in 15, you saw it just a second ago, but it says that God set me apart before I was born, and he called me by his grace. Here's why this is huge if you haven't been listening to the rest of the story. Paul was on a mission to destroy Christianity. Okay? Now, I just want you, don't assume this past this 1 minute illustration, but I want you to assume that you're God, okay? You're trying to create something pretty significant in the first century, okay? You're trying to create something in the first century that will last at least till 2013 in San Francisco, right? You're trying to create that. You got this guy who's trying to kill your people. You got this guy who's trying to extinguish your movement. What are you going to do if you're God? Come on, anything goes here. Like lightning, zap, right? Like just fall over dead, have him hung. Because God is so gracious and he's not us. While Paul is killing Christians, or at least approving of it, and while he is imprisoning people, and while he's seeking not just to stop, but to destroy the movement of God, God is saying, I can't believe he's doing this. I don't want him to do this, but I'm going to use him to advance the movement more than anyone else in the first century except Christ. That's grace. I wouldn't do that. I know you're nicer than I am, but you wouldn't do it either. But God goes, no, I know that he's approving of the death of Stephen. I know that he's trying to extinguish the movement that I'm going to be up to all for all of eternity. But I set him apart. My grace is so much that the guy who's trying to kill my movement, I'm going to make sure he takes the movement to unprecedented places. Why? Because of one of our 6 or 7 values here at Epic. Because of the grace of Jesus, your past doesn't get to dictate your future. Your past doesn't have to dictate your future. Somebody go, Ben, you don't know where my past was. Listen, I assume you weren't destroying God's thing in the first century. But even if you were, here's the message. Grace overcomes. Grace is so overcoming that there's no telling what God might yet do in your life. You say, but Ben, I'm in my 50s or 60s, 70s. Your heart's still beating. There's still time. God has something perhaps new for you that will just blow your mind. You say, Ben, I don't even believe in this God. Well, your story might become the best one. He's going to win your heart over. Grace is going to invade your hard heart. And there's no telling how you might lead the next generation of this movement of Christianity. I tell my wife this and our staff this quite often. I just can't believe that I get to be a part of this. And I don't mean leading this. I just mean sitting in the circles. I just mean hearing the story over coffee. We had a Uganda team meeting yesterday, and I was just blown away to hear the story of what God's been up to in these 16 or 17, 18 people. And I said, Shauna, if those 18 people were our church, I would be satisfied. I just can't believe we get to be a part of it. I know where this thing started for me. I wouldn't want you to know, but I know where it began. So unlikely that I'm here. But I assume if you have a God story, that's probably true for you as well. Then Paul gets into what I love. He goes on and talks about his travels. Then he gets to 23, and I want you to hear this. He says, he who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. Do you see that? He says, the only thing that they knew about me, this was my reputation. It's a huge, huge storyline. He says, they only heard about me that he who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. Paul lets us know something about his story that's true for every one of us who have the God story interrupting and rescuing our life. Here it is. Every one of us has a used to story and a now story. What's yours? I'll give you just the short version of mine. I used to be a very rebellious young man. I used to be the guy that looked my mother in the face and said, you and those ladies, you can pray for me every Monday night at that church if you want to, but it's not going to help. I'm not going to change. I used to have terrible issues with anger and tempers. I'm overwhelmed to think about, in spite of all that, that's just not my used to story. I've not arrived yet. I've not been made perfect. Please don't hold me to that. But that's who I used to be. But this gospel has rescued me. Now I have something different than that to give to my sons. Now I have something different than that to give to this congregation. It's crazy that I have anything to do with what God's up to in Epic Church. Crazy, and I mean anything. Some of us will be so stubborn and so left in our disbelief that we won't embrace faith because we just think God's written us off. But you have a used to story, and you can have a now story. You've heard Paul's version, his short version. You've heard my short version. I want to invite 3 of my friends from the Epic community to come on up and just share with you really their short version. And if something that they share in their story and you want to hear the long version, take them out to a nice meal and ask for the long version, okay? But just so we're clear, Michelle's going to go first. She's married, so make sure, girls, you can take her out. Guys, you can't. Brian and I will be on you. Austin is single as of this last night, so I assume that's still the case. And Susan's in that camp as well. So, but seriously, just share the short version of kind of what you guys shared with me yesterday and the 9:30 service, so they can hear, like, hey, this is one grand story, but it can look different. All of us have a unique situation. Go ahead.
So my story started when I was a baby, and my mother died when I was an infant. My father raised me as a single father, and when I was a child, he fell away from the church, and I lost connection with the only faith community that I had known. I prayed for God to change my circumstance, and when he didn't answer those prayers, I felt lost, alone, and distant from God. When I was in college, I was studying, and there was this fantastic rainstorm, and the lights went out in my building. And as I was sitting in the dark in college, I remember just feeling that I didn't want to be in the dark anymore, and that I needed his light. And at that time in my life, he had placed a friend's family in my life. They were a very strong Christian family. And I was able to go to church with my friend's family that weekend. And I was able to pray with my friend's mother. And I've been following him since. And in my story, I know that he was with me through that whole path.
That's good. Austin?
So I grew up in a broken home. I practiced Islam for a while with an abusive stepfather, and Christ saved my mother and kind of pulled us out of that. But I saw that as an opportunity for myself to that I was more mature or more well put together than other people around me, and sort of saw it as me being better and that I could handle the world. And so I rode that through college. But when I came out here, newly single, new life, lots of people who were better than me at a lot of different things, kind of got lost, couldn't find my way. And so I ended up just talking with a friend of mine, coming to Epic Church, and through Christ I can see that there's a purpose in today, that my past doesn't have to define me, and that the path before me is exciting, and that I should be looking forward to it.
Awesome. Susan?
Good morning. I grew up in a Christian home. Never knew my father, never met him, still haven't. When I was 7 years old, my mom decided to leave a homosexual lifestyle. And I love my mom with all my heart, but it was tough to grow up in that type of lifestyle. So I decided to start looking for my dad, and I did start looking for him. But as I was looking for him, I began to go to church, and God helped me see that he was my father, that he was my center, and he was the one that I had always been looking for. And that's my story, and he's been with me through all my life.
Well, thanks to all of you guys for sharing. Yeah. Wanted you to hear Paul's story, to hear a little bit of my story, and we'd all love to share more and to hear these guys' story, because there is a similar thread, but it's very unique circumstances. Usually there's relational situations, or there's other things that happen, or there's things that surprise us, or a whole lot of things. But what you need to know is that God in Jesus is overcoming whatever it is that you've done. And listen, it's not because he takes our sin lightly. He's a holy God. Can't just look at it and go, that's fine. No, something has to be paid for it, and something was paid for it, so that your past, present, your future sins can be atoned for, and you can find all the approval you could ever want in Jesus. So after you've heard Paul's story and my story and Susan and Austin and Michelle's story, I've got to ask you, what's your story about receiving the gospel? Do you have a story? I didn't say, do you have a church story? Because without this gospel story, church story is not going to help us much. I didn't ask about your parents' faith, because at the end of the day, you're going to have to own it yourself. Though they can have great influence, and I hope that as parents, we will have great influence. What's your story? Do you know this kind of thing? Would you like to know more about it? If so, we don't always have time on Sunday mornings, though we're available. But if you want to meet with one of our staff or one of these three to hear their story, or your small group leaders throughout our church, host of people that would be glad to meet with you about it. And then a question as you begin to think about your story and how you share your story, you need to ask this. Does your story and how you share it glorify you or God? Does your story, my guess is if it glorifies you, it might not be the kind of story you want to stay in for long. Because when we get rescued, as we said last week, if someone rescues us from the Pacific Ocean, we don't come out of the water talking about how awesome we are, right? I mean, please don't. We come out so grateful and overwhelmed to the one who rescued us. And that's what this story really is about. And so I hope that you have a story. Baptism, if next week a day for you to you know what, if a baptism or the fact that you haven't taken that step is because you're wondered, oh, I've been a Christian a long time, what will people think? Or, oh, my coworkers, what will they think? Or so-and-so doesn't even know I go to church. All of that, it could be a huge, just nail that down in the ground, this approval issue. Right? It deals with the approval issue and the story issue. Baptism depicts this great story of Christ cleansing us from our sin, making us new. And it also shows, you know what, I care more about what this God thinks than what I do about this world or this culture. And just so you know, people here in this Epic community, they're going to be thrilled for you. Okay? Because I'll excommunicate them if they aren't. I got your back. Not that you're living for my approval, but I would love to celebrate that with you next week. Pastor Tim will be at the back after our services, and he'd love to talk to you about that. And really cool. What's about to happen is I'm going to pray in just a moment, and then we're going to move into a secondary time of worship and communion. And so it'll be a time just for you to respond to this reality that we've expressed today. And let's not rush into that. The scriptures are clear that we don't just want to get in line and take the bread, dip it in the cup, and that's it. I've kind of done. Because remember, communion's not about religion. It's about Jesus saying, remember. Remember, it's not about you. It's not about their approval. Remember, this is grace. It is overcome. It is overwhelmed. It has made you new by the very act of his body, represented by the bread being crushed for us, his blood represented by the cup being spilled out for us. So you can sit there. Maybe there's some sin in your life. You just need to confess in your heart to God, especially along the lines of approval or trying to gain his acceptance. Maybe you just need to be overwhelmed with gratefulness because you've just realized that you can't get yourself to God, but that you don't have to. I know when that frees my heart, I'm just like, God, I'm so prone to work and achieve it, but you just give it. It is a costly gift, but it's free to us, which is amazing. And then when you're ready, we'll be able to receive the communion elements. We'll form lines here and here. We'll line up, eventually we'll end up in a line around that wall. Brad, we may want to do an extra song this morning. Got a big crowd, which is fine. It's exciting. And we'll just go through. But whatever it is you need to do, and then maybe as you learn the songs that they're going to sing this morning, and as we just declare what God has done and what we want him to do, maybe on our faces and with our voices, we should show that it's like hearing the good news for the very first time. And I know you have a neighbor. Most of you, everybody's got a neighbor this morning. They won't be able to hear you, okay? And even if they do, and they put their hands in their ear, just like, I don't need your approval, all right? So I want to pray for us. I'm going to ask God to move over these moments. I'm going to ask the things like these ladies said, and like Austin said, I'm going to ask that God would clarify some things for you in these moments, and not just that it ends here, but that some things would just be, they would have a light shown on them, like Michelle said, so that you might see what's available. And remember, when we understand that it's the gospel of grace and not religion, that can never lead to pride. It always has to lead to humility and gratefulness. So if we find pride in our hearts, it's probably because we're depending on ourselves. When we realize what Jesus has done for us, it will only bring about humility. You've been approved by God in Jesus. Live in that. Lean into that. Embrace that. Don't live for the approval of others.